Jeremy Clarkson, TV's most opinionated petrolhead, passed his driving test in his grandfather's Bentley R-Type back in 1977. Fast forward a few decades later, and he's owned 28 jaw-dropping cars, from brutal AMGs to fire-spitting Lamborghinis. With a $70 million net worth and a career built on speed, sarcasm, and smoking tires, Clarkson's garage is just as legendary as the man himself. Let's take a look at some of his most outrageous rides. Let's start with one of the cars that really stands out in his collection. Not because it's a modern supercar, but because it's a piece of his history. The 1969 Cortina Mark II 1600E. Now, if you know anything about Clarkson, you know he's always had a bit of a soft spot for Fords. His very first car was actually a white Cortina, so this Mark II 1600E is a proper nostalgia trip for him, and honestly, it's a gem. Back in the 60s, the Cortina was Britain's answer to the everyday saloon car, but the 1600E wasn't just any old Cortina. It was the posh Cortina. It had a 1.6-liter engine with a bit more kick, fancy wood trim, and sporty suspension tuning. It was that kind of car that made you feel like a boss, even if you were just driving to the shops. Of course, Clarkson, being Clarkson, his love for Fords didn't stop there. He also got his hands on something slightly more powerful, a 2005 Ford GT. Let's just say, if the Cortina was a charming throwback, the GT was a full-on sledgehammer. A 5.4-liter supercharged V8, 550 horsepower, and a 0 to 60 time of 3.3 seconds. Yeah, that's a tiny upgrade from the Cortina. The GT was basically America's way of saying, hey Ferrari, we can do that too, and it did, at 205 miles an hour. But here's the kicker. Clarkson actually had a bit of a love-hate relationship with his GT. He loved the car, but it had a nasty habit of breaking down. A lot. In true Clarkson fashion, he ranted about it on Top Gear, but deep down, you could tell he was obsessed with it. And honestly, who wouldn't be? Next is one car in his garage that stands out for a different reason. His dark green Bentley Continental GT. Now, this isn't just any Bentley. It's his favorite non-performance car, which, let's be honest, is a bit ironic considering this thing still packs a 6-liter twin-turbo W12 under the hood, and yeah, you heard that right. 12 cylinders of pure British luxury, churning out a massive 900 Newton-meters of torque and 550 horsepower. To put that into perspective, that's 50 more horsepower than a Ferrari 575, and yet Clarkson doesn't even consider it a performance car. Classic. But that's the magic of the Bentley Continental GT. It's not just about lap times or cornering like a race car, it's about effortless power and supreme comfort. This is the kind of car where you sink into the plush leather seats, put on your most ridiculous pair of sunglasses, and glide across the countryside like the steak. It's fast, sure, but it doesn't shout about it. It just does it. And let's not forget, this thing cost him $222,500, which means Clarkson didn't just buy a Bentley. He bought into the idea that sometimes driving doesn't have to be a loud, aggressive, tire-smoking event. Sometimes it can just be nice. And if a man who spent decades screaming about power and speed can admit that, well, maybe the Bentley Continental GT really is something special. Now, when you think of Jeremy Clarkson's car collection, you picture brutal speed, ridiculous power, and a fair bit of British charm. And that is exactly what you get with his Aston Martin Virage. But here's the twist. It is one of the rarest cars he owns. The Virage is one of those blink and you'll miss it cars because Aston Martin only built it for 1 year. That's right, this beautiful machine was here in 2011 and gone by 2012, making it a bit of an automotive unicorn, and yet Clarkson managed to get his hands on one. But here is the real kicker. He only paid $25,000 for it. Let that sink in. A hand-built Aston Martin with a 5.9-liter V12 pumping out 490 horsepower and capable of hitting 186 miles an hour for the price of a well-optioned Toyota Camry. Now, sure, it's not the fastest or most famous Aston ever made, but it's got that old-school Aston charm. It's sleek, muscular, and just effortlessly cool. Exactly the kind of car you'd expect to see in a Bond film. And while 0 to 60 in 4.6 seconds might not sound earth-shattering in today's world of electric rockets, this thing isn't about brutal acceleration. It's about style. And as you can imagine, when it comes to Jeremy Clarkson's car collection, there are some absolute monsters in there, but few are as wild as his Mercedes-Benz SLS AMG Roadster. This thing is pure luxury and exactly the kind of car you'd expect Clarkson to love. Under the hood, you've got a 6.2-liter naturally aspirated V8 that screams all the way to 7,200 RPM, producing 583 horsepower and 479 pound-feet of torque. That's enough to launch this open-top missile from 0 to 60 in just 3.7 seconds, and keep going until it hits 197 miles an hour. In other words, it's not just fast, it's properly fast. Now, the standard SLS AMG is already an icon, thanks to its gull-wing doors and its nod to the legendary 300SL, but Clarkson, he went for the Roadster. No roof, no gull-wings, just raw, open-air performance. And honestly, can you blame him? With an engine that sounds this good, you want to hear every last bit of that glorious AMG thunder. And if that wasn't enough Mercedes madness, he also owns a 1971 Mercedes 600 Grosser. That's right, he's got both ends of the spectrum covered. On one hand, the SLS AMG Roadster is a brutal modern supercar. On the other, the 600 Grosser is an ultra-luxury land yacht from the 70s, powered by a 6.3-liter V8 and famously driven by celebrities, dictators, and basically anyone who wanted to flex on the world. So Clarkson's got two very different Mercs in his collection, one for going insanely fast and the other for ruling the road like an emperor. And honestly, that sounds about right for him. Now, if you know anything about Jeremy Clarkson, then you know he spent his entire career making fun of small, underpowered cars. He's called them rubbish, laughed at their tiny engines, and on Top Gear done everything short of launching them into space. And yet one of these cars is in his collection. It is a Mini Cooper. But this isn't just any Mini. It was actually a gift from his daughter. And let's be real, when your kid gives you a car, you're keeping it no matter what. But in this case, it's actually a proper British icon. The classic Mini was in production from 1959 to 2000. And despite its tiny size, it became one of the most legendary small cars ever made. It had between 34 and 59 horsepower, a top speed of around 77 miles an hour, and yet somehow it became the go-to car for everyone from rally drivers to city dwellers. Now, does it fit in with Clarkson's usual taste for massive engines and ridiculous power? Absolutely not. This is a man who once owned a Ford GT with 550 horsepower, an SLS AMG Roadster that could hit nearly 200 miles an hour, and a 6-liter W12 Bentley Continental GT. So a little Mini might seem out of place, but at the end of the day, it is a car with history and sentimental value. And honestly, that probably makes it more special than half of the supercars in his garage. Now, Jeremy Clarkson has driven a lot of cars in his lifetime. Some incredible, some terrible, and some hilariously unreliable. And if you know anything about him, you know he has a weird, undying love for Alfa Romeos. Enter the 1986 Alfa Romeo GT V6, a car that is equal parts brilliant and infuriating, which is exactly why Clarkson loves it. This wasn't just any Alfa. It was one of the most iconic sports coupes of the 1980s. Built with a steel unibody construction and a glorious manual transmission, the GT V6 was the kind of car that made you work for the experience. It wasn't the fastest or the most reliable, but it had soul, and for Clarkson, that's always been more important than just raw numbers. Despite all of its quirks, and the occasional electrical gremlins that came with classic Alfa, the GT V6 was a hit, making up 1/3 of Alfa Romeo's GTV sales in the 80s. It was a car for the people who loved driving, people who didn't mind a little bit of drama every time they turned the key. And honestly, that's exactly why Clarkson owns one. He said so himself. You're not a true petrolhead until you've owned an Alfa, and the GTV6, well, it's one of the best examples of why people keep coming back to Alfa Romeo, even when they know it's going to break their hearts. Now, when Jeremy Clarkson, of all people, calls a car the best in the world, you know it has to be something special. And according to him, the title belongs to none other than the 2008 Range Rover L322 Vogue. In fact, he goes a step further, calling it the, quote, best 4x4 ever made. Now, Clarkson isn't exactly known for loving practical cars. He prefers ludicrous horsepower, deafening exhaust notes, and zero regard for fuel economy. But the L22, this is a car he actually uses, and not just for cruising around London. This thing played a key role in Clarkson's farm. If you've seen the show, you know that between battling sheep, fixing fences, and dealing with the endless farming disasters, the Range Rover was one of the few things that actually worked properly. Unless you also count Clarkson's idea of gardening. Anyway, the L322 came with two engine options, a 3.6-liter TDV8 diesel with 268 horsepower or a 4.4-liter V8 petrol pushing 302 horsepower. Neither was meant for setting lap records, but they weren't really slow either, with a top speed of 124 miles an hour. Not bad for a massive luxury off-roader, and that's what makes it so special. It's comfortable, capable, and absurdly good at everything from off-roading to long highway cruises. Clarkson's love for the Range Rover isn't just about specs, it's about how it makes life easier. Unlike his many supercars, which require care, patience, and the occasional tow truck, the L322 is the one car he can always count on. And if it's good enough to survive Clarkson's farm, that alone proves why it is the best 4x4 in the world. Now, when you think of Jeremy Clarkson's car collection, you probably picture loud, overpowered, and slightly ridiculous machines. And you'd be right. But there's one car in his garage that blends brute force with absolute luxury, the 2022 Bentley Flying Spur. This isn't just any Bentley, it's a 6-liter twin-turbo W12-powered missile that pushes 626 horsepower and a monstrous 664 pound-feet of torque. That means this nearly 5,400-pound luxury sedan can launch from 0 to 60 in just 3.6 seconds and hit a top speed of 207 miles an hour. Let that sink in. A car built for chauffeuring millionaires is faster than most sports cars. Clarkson has never been one to hide his love for Bentleys, and the Flying Spur is just another reason why. It's got the power of a supercar, the comfort of a private jet, and enough posh British charm to make even James May jealous. So, while it might not be the flashiest car in the collection, it's probably one of the ones he enjoys the most. Because why wouldn't you love a car that makes insane speed feel effortless? Now, when Jeremy Clarkson gets excited about a car, you know it's something brutal, loud, and slightly unhinged. And that is exactly what the Mercedes-Benz CLK 63 AMG Black Series is. An absolute monster with zero regard for subtlety. This thing is powered by a 6.2-liter naturally aspirated V8 that cranks out 507 horsepower and 465 pound-feet of torque. That means 0 to 62 miles an hour in just 4.2 seconds and a top speed of 186. But forget the numbers for a second. The real magic of this car is the sound. The CLK 63 Black Series has one of the most distinctive exhaust notes of any AMG, a deep, snarling growl that makes it sound like it's constantly angry at the world.
Not a very funny joke, it's not laughing, it's going blah, blah, blah. It's just politely chuckling. That's what it is.
It's also a proper track weapon, unlike most AMGs at the time, which were made more about brute force than handling. The Black Series had a wider stance, stiffer suspension, and a limited slip differential to keep it planted. Mercedes basically stripped out the luxury, added carbon fiber everywhere, and turned it into a street-legal DTM car. And of course, Clarkson loved it. He's always had a soft spot for lunatic-level horsepower wrapped in something that looks vaguely sensible, and this car fits that bill perfectly. It's a no-nonsense, tire-shredding, ear-shattering AMG at its absolute best. Exactly the kind of car that Clarkson would take out for a drive just to scare the neighbors. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel to see more videos like this.